Lift up your hands, ye heroes, and swear with proud disdain. The wretch that would ensnare you shall lay his snares in vain. Should Europe empty all her force, we'll meet her in array, and fight and shout and shout and fight for North America.
Okay, welcome back everybody to turns 4, 5, and 6, the spring turns of Avalon Hill's 1974 war game 1776, detailing the American Revolution. That was, of course, the British Grenadiers, or at least the American version of that song. Once again, this is Captain Dave speaking from the bunker, and I think before we get started with the interphase and turns 4, 5, and 6, let's sum up what's happened in the winter, the first, second, and third turns of the game. In the South, almost nothing has happened. The reason for that is things don't really get interesting until the British regulars appear, and there are no British regulars in the South. And that's because if the British regulars are not occupying a strategic town, the Americans are considered to control it, regardless of what the Tory militia is doing. In the North, after a long, cold winter, things are starting to heat up. At the end of the quarter, British regular reinforcements have shown up on the ocean horizon with a fleet of British warships, and they're going to sail for Boston. What they did in history was that they sailed for Charleston, South Carolina, and attempted to take that, which did not end well for the British. In my game, I'm ordering those troops to Boston because the overall strategy is to build up British forces in New England and attempt to conquer from there once they have a significant advantage. The Americans, looking at this buildup of British forces, have decided that it's time for the siege of Boston to come to an end. Eventually, they're going to be greatly outnumbered if the British stick to this plan. And the Americans, I said in the last episode that their plan was to not lose, and that kind of sounds like a stupid argument. Everybody's plan is to not lose, but specifically what I meant for that was they should not get into a serious engagement which could result in the destruction of the American army. They need to not fight big battles. They need to retreat and hit the British where they can, try and spread them out as they go conquering through New England. So the Americans have a problem. And the problem is, if the British build up a significant amount of forces to overwhelm the Americans naturally probably want to run away from that rather than be decisively defeated. And the problem is that they now have artillery with them, and artillery is slow to move. And if the Americans escort that artillery, that will slow down their army enough that the British, if they leave their artillery behind, can easily catch them. So they've decided to get a head start on this retreat, and that's what's shown here in the picture, that the American forces have decided to move to the west to avoid the British. Okay, it's time for the first interphase. What you're looking at here is the rules book, of course, and on the bottom of this page is the matrix which decides how much militia for both the Tories and the rebels is allowed in each area. Additionally, it shows how many colonial army points are recruited. There's a difference here. You recruit those army units, you keep them until something destroys them, but the militia for both sides, that's the number they have in each area at the beginning of the quarter. And that means that if you have more militia than what is called for, you have to remove militia points to bring it down to that number. And of course, if you have less, you bring it up to that number. Now this can come into play in a big way. If you've marched rebel militia out of their area and you have a big army of militia in one area that's made up of militia from various areas, you might take a lot of losses as they're reduced in the next quarter to what numbers they should have. So the next thing you do is you compare the British regulars and how many strategic towns they occupy with each of the regions. And in the Deep South, and South Central actually it's the same situation, there are no British regulars in the area. So that means in the Deep South, 2 colonial army units are recruited. And in the South, they started with 8 rebel militia, now they can only afford 4, so adjustments have to be made. And the Tory militia, they started with 6 and now they're allowed 7, so they get 1 extra Tory militia in the Deep South. In the South Central region, the Colonial Army recruits 3 new strength points. Rebel militia, they started the game with 6 rebel militia in that area. They're now limited to 3. And Tory militia, they started with 3 and they're now limited to 5. So they actually make a gain, whereas the Colonials lose 3 in terms of militia. And placing those new units on the board, this is what the southern colonies look like after the first interphase. So going back to the more northerly states, in the middle states area, the Colonials recruit 4 regular army units. In the rebel militia area, they started with 6 in the beginning of the game. They maintain that number, and the same with Tory militia. They had 6 at the start of the game and have 6 currently. Now, one thing which can kind of throw you off here is that for these purposes, the middle states are including Canada, and there are British regular units in Canada, so that will change the calculation by how many replacements show up in this area. Finally, we have New England. The Colonial Army recruits 4 more regulars in colonial New England at this time. In terms of militia, they started with 8 and now they're limited to 7, so a small change there. Tory militia does not change. They had a very small amount to start the game of 1 unit, and they are limited to only 1 strength point at this time. So this is what it looks like in New England at the end of the first interphase turn. Probably the biggest change at this point is the Colonial Army that's shown up in the middle states and in New England outside Springfield. The middle states, they all mustered in New York City, and they're getting ready to march north to aid General Washington. Finally, this is when new supply units are generated. The Americans get new supply units in each area not controlled by the British, and the British don't control any areas right now. So right now they put a supply unit with the Colonial Army outside Hillsborough, another one in Alexandria in Virginia, Springfield, Massachusetts, and one in New York City. Whereas the British, they also get some new supply this turn. They get 2 British regulars in addition to supply. So the British get 2 regulars at this point. They're going to put them in any controlled port. Going with the strategy, they have to put them in Boston, or they are going to put them in Boston. They also get 2 supply units in any of 5 major cities that are ports that are controlled by the British. Of those 5, only 1 is actually controlled by the British at this time, and that's Boston. So new reinforcements for the British there. So now it's glorious spring. The British go first, and they have to decide what are they going to do. The Americans have retreated somewhat from Boston, so they start to think, well, maybe now's the time for me to start making the big attack. And ultimately, they decide that's a bad idea. The thing is, the Americans have been reinforcing in the same way that the British have been reinforcing. Militia has been flooding in, new recruits have been raised, so that at this point, despite the reinforcements the British have gotten, the Americans have more. So if they attack the Americans, they're going to be at an odds disadvantage of at least 1 to 2 odds. The British can bring their artillery, but even by doing that, that makes no difference, because again, it doesn't help with unless there are entrenchments and fortifications. The Americans have neither. They no longer have a supply advantage. They can bring plenty of supply, but the Americans also have plenty of supply. So their strategy remains the same, is to hold Boston and wait for big reinforcements in the future. So what does happen on turn 4? First, the Tory militia leaves Norfolk and Portsmouth to meet up with other militia near Warrenton to interfere with the Colonial Army gathering there. On their turn, the Colonial Army retreats to meet up with rebel militia in Guilford. A battle may be brewing in the South without British regular. Despite my prediction, it would stay peaceful until invaded. Meanwhile, other Colonial Army units in Virginia head north to join the main show, getting no further than Maryland this turn. In the north, the British, as stated before, are staying in Boston. They need to be able to build up their forces to the point where they can challenge the Americans, and this is partially going to happen because there are significant rebel militia and Indian forces ready to cross the Berkshire Mountains into Massachusetts. On their turn, the Americans march into Connecticut and are now west of New Haven, Connecticut. This is significant for the British because for the first time the American army has moved far enough away from Boston that they can't march into the city in one turn. So therefore the British can march out of the city and have confidence that whatever happens, they won't lose this strategic town, at least on that turn. So now it's May 1776, turn 5 in the game, and the big news is that 20 British regulars have now appeared in Quebec. They've been sent from the British Parliament to raise the siege of Quebec. The siege is already lifted, but that's where the regulars are now showing up. So their plan is to begin the march down the St. Lawrence River and clean up the remnants of the American invasion, which is now hanging out in Montreal and St. James. And then they plan to start a march on Ticonderoga, which is one of the settlement cities which can lead to British victory. So that's what you see here. The 20 strength points have already left Quebec, toting their artillery with them, and they've gotten as far but no further than, and I will probably butcher the French pronunciation, Trois-Rivières, Three Rivers, Canada. Elsewhere on this turn, the British Army leaves Boston with 21 strength points and 1 Tory militia, marching west so that they're northeast of Springfield at this point. Additionally, there is a force of 6 Tory militia and 3 Indians just across the Berkshire Mountains. They cross the mountains and link up with the British, so that the British force between Indians, militia, and regulars now totals 31 strength points, plus of course an artillery and 2 supply. Boston kept 4 British regulars, artillery, supply, and of course the entrenchment to defend against any unexpected move from the Americans. In the South Central and Deep South, Tory militia marches south from Virginia, while other Tory militia abandon their fort in the south and march north, all in an attempt to intercept the Colonial Army and rebel militia stack, which is heading north. It's 5 Tory militia from the south, 7 Tory militia from the north, trying to catch 2 Colonial Army, 4 rebel militia, 2 supply, and artillery. As we come to the American turn, General Washington has a decision to make. He has a slight preponderance of forces. He has 26 Colonial Army and 8 rebel militia for a grand total of 34 strength points, whereas the British have 21 British regulars, 7 Tory militia, and 3 Indian for 31. So it's 34 versus 31. So there will be no real advantages here. Nobody's entrenched. Artillery won't play a factor. So Washington has to make a decision here. Does he want to risk everything to try and destroy the British Army? Well, you could continue to play it cautiously as the Americans, but that's not what I'm going to do this turn. And here's my reasoning behind that. First of all, George Washington was a very aggressive commander. Given the choice, he would always rather attack than do anything else. And in addition to that, he never, in this game, got Boston back for the Americans. He's never fought a major battle. There have been no major battles in this game. Here we are in turn 5. And he's proceeding to retreat throughout New England. And you got to believe that the Continental Congress in Philadelphia is looking at this going, when are you going to put up a fight? Well, I don't have that stress. I don't have the Continental Congress looking over my shoulder, but I do have a lot of YouTube video viewers, and they're probably saying the same thing. Captain Dave, when are you going to put up a fight? So I say that time is now. So let's see what happens. Obviously laid out here, you can see the armies in all their glory, and we'll begin the fight. So we'll do round 1, 34 strength points versus 30, with the Americans moving towards Springfield to attack the British Army. First we do the tactics card. Washington picks reconnaissance in force, and the British commander, probably Clinton at this point, picks refuse the right. So if you compare those two on the tactical card matrix, that's +0, so nobody gets an advantage. So it's a straight up roll. There are no real advantages here. A straight up roll on the 1-to-1 table. So on the 1-to-1 table, a die is rolled, and a 2 is what comes up. and the result is no effect. So not only are there no losses in this first round of battle, there are no subsequent rounds of battle. That ends the action that takes place in this battle phase. So there it was, the big decisive battle just kind of fizzled out and didn't happen. I don't know, maybe they're getting ready to shoot at each other and a big rainstorm blew in. Elsewhere, the Americans who are marching up from Virginia have now made it to Philadelphia, so hopefully they'll be in the fight before too much longer. And of course, the force moving up from the Deep South has now reached the North Carolina-Virginia border, so they're growing closer as well. So now it's turn 6, June 1776. And as Sir General James Admiral Akbar might have exclaimed, "It's a trap!" Yep, it is a trap. Because this turn, more British reinforcements show up. 19 British regulars, a supply and an artillery, show up at Boston. In Boston, they'll leave the artillery behind and they'll march to the sound of the guns and join in with the British army that is facing off against General Washington. So you add the British regulars, the ones who are already here. The 21 plus 19 means there are now 40 strength points of British regulars in this battle. Not too often in many war games do you have a unit that's worth 40 points, but here you get to see it in all its glory. So here it is. Will this be the decisive battle which decides the fate of the American Revolution? Well, we go to round 1 of the battle, and the British choose a recon in force. The Americans choose withdrawal. General Washington has looked at the odds. He sees that they're 3-2 odds, and he's at a disadvantage, so he wants to get out as quickly as possible. So you compare those two tactics, and that means the British attackers have +2 to the die roll, which is very auspicious. So the die is rolled, and referring to the combat results table, this is the 3-2 column with the British advantage, and they have +2 on the die roll. They roll a die and get a 1. So they roll that 1, becomes a 3, and that becomes two interesting things happen. The attacker loses 1 strength point and the defender loses 1 strength point. And that's bad for the British for 2 reasons. Because number 1, you see that red border around it, that means that's the only round of combat that occurs. So nothing decisive has occurred. And you can say, well, they both lost 1 strength point, it's pretty much a push. It's a little bit of a disadvantage for the British because there are an order to losses that have to take place. Militia is killed before regular units, but before militia is killed, the Indians die. And the Indians are allies for the British, but they don't have the manpower to stick through heavy losses. When they lose, they go away forever. That unit is just completely destroyed. And so that the Indian contingent goes from 3 strength points down to 2, and it will never come back, unlike regular militia, which can regenerate in the quarterly turns. So now it's the American turn, and they have a decision to make. But before we get to that, I want to talk about something that I mentioned in my first video, which is that an unfortunate design decision of this game can result in there being very, very large towers of units. Nothing wrong with that, except it's a little unsightly and it's a little unwieldy. It's too easy to knock those towers over. So I've come up with a workaround, which I mentioned on my first video. When the towers grow too high, the game does provide some extra blank counters, and I've written on one blank counter General Howe, and that will be the massive stack of British units, and now I only have 1 unit to move. And of course General Washington gets a second one. So as I said, the Americans have a choice to make. They can finally achieve their objective this turn of capturing Boston. They could walk away from this battle, march over to Boston. The British only have 4 strength points guarding Boston. And in addition to that, they have 2 artillery and they're still entrenched. Well, with the American forces in play, that brings them up to 5-1, actually more than 5-1. But normally if you have more than 5-1 odds, if you have 6-1 odds, that's an overrun attack. The enemy can be completely eliminated, but because they're entrenched, the Americans have to make an actual attack on Boston. And they could do this, and if you look at the combat results table, you will quickly see that 5-to-1 odds are very favorable to the attacker. The one thing to keep in mind is that with the entrenchment and the two artillery, the Americans will have a -3 on their die roll. But even so, you have to roll an actual 1 for the Americans to take a loss all by themselves. A 2, you subtract 3 from that, that's -2 and -1 at that point. So that means both sides would lose 1. So anything but a 1 and the British will be at least ground down, if not completely destroyed. The best that the British can roll, of course, is a 6. You subtract 3 from that, and that eliminates half of the army. So that's only going to last 1 or 2 rounds. But if you look at this screen, you'll see that I've used that single counter for General Washington representing his army, that I've moved them away from Springfield, further down the coast to the very edge of Connecticut, getting ready to move into New York State. And you might say, well, if you had the ability to capture Boston, to destroy the 4 strength points, to destroy or capture the magazine which is there, and capture the artillery that's there, that would seem to be a great victory for the Americans. Why don't you do it? And here's the reason why. That even though they captured Boston, they haven't done anything about the British Army. The British Army still significantly outnumbers them, and you know they'd be coming for revenge. And that decisive battle is going to happen sooner or later. Right now it's just been luck, which is limited to the battles to only 1 or 2 rounds at the most. So they have this British army which is going to come on and pin them in Boston, maybe destroy them in Boston. And if that's not bad enough, in just 2 more turns, 2 short months, the largest contingent of British reinforcements coming from England are going to arrive, and they can show up in any controlled British port. And that's 24 strength points that can link up with the existing strength points. And then the Americans, they don't want to be anywhere near that. They want to fade back into the interior of the continent to try and make sure they don't get decisively defeated, which again would be a disaster at this point in the game. So you can see what I've decided for Washington is he's withdrawing. He's backing up and going to play the long game with the British. In Canada, meanwhile, the British forces marching from Quebec end up outside the gates of Montreal across the St. Lawrence River from their objective. For their part, on their turn, the Americans are going to abandon Montreal and put all of their forces into St. John's underneath the fortress marker. So they will have 6 strength points, which will be doubled, which will be enough to force a 1-to-1 attack if the British decide to storm the gates. In the south, you can see here that the force that's marched up from the deep south has now made it to mid-Virginia, so they're closing in on Washington's army. And here you can see the force that started in Virginia is just north of Morristown, whereas the militia in New York has marched out to try and cover the artillery, which is just over the southern Berkshire Mountains from Washington's main army. And that's it for spring 1776. We'll start with turn 7, which is the summer of 1776. We'll see whether the Founding Fathers get to sign the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia or not, because the British are now on the move, and the American forces under General Washington, they've done what they needed to do. They've stayed intact, but they have not yet had the big victory that they hope to someday have. So that's it for now. We'll see you next Thursday with the summer turn of 1776.